Okay, and I'll just roughly tell you what's going to happen. Speaker's going to give the lecture. We're going to have a Q&A as usual, which will be chaired by my colleague Neil Gregor. I should also mention very insistently that there is a very nice reception after this right outside. There is wine with it, and I feel like as though I'm on The Apprentice, this very premium quality reception. So you're going to really get your quality. So I can always kind of lock the doors, and it's a real opportunity to speak to have a chat afterwards, share ideas, and talk to the speaker, of course. So I really will be pushing this, and so will everyone else before the end of the lecture. So anyway, just a little bit before we start. This is the 13th Southampton Stonewall Lecture. I think I've been saying it's the 14th, being a bit too keen. But 13th is very lucky for us in view of the speaker that we've got tonight. We've had many illustrious speakers in this series over the years, from George Chauncey on Gay New York to Laura Doan on Alan Turing. We've had Bruce Smith talking about gay Shakespeare. We've had Howard Chang on the trans history of East Asia. And last year, Dan Healy, who's here tonight, spoke about the queer history of the Russian-Ukrainian War. The name of our Stonewall Lecture Series comes from the historic Stonewall riots, which erupted in New York in 1969. But secondly, it comes because we're proud to link ourselves to the UK's Stonewall charity, which in the past 30 years has done so much to transform LGBTQ lives across the UK. So the purpose of our annual lecture is threefold, really, as I think you know. Firstly, to explore our rich LGBT heritage and present cutting-edge research on queer history. Secondly, to promote our university values of equality, diversity and inclusivity. And thirdly, to understand our modern world in all its diversity through educating ourselves about the queer past. Now, those of you who regularly attend these lectures, and I can see several veterans here who have come since 2012, you will know that our aim is to make the lecture series as diverse as possible, covering different periods of history, and in fact the full range of queer lives and experiences around the world. And this is reflected very much in our speaker tonight, who I'm just going to introduce now. So our speaker is Jennifer Evans. She's Professor of History at Carleton University in Ottawa. She's been there since 2001, and she became full professor in 2016. She did her BA at McGill University, Montreal, and then her PhD in New York. Jennifer is a major authority on fascism, populism, and Cold War history, with a focus on Germany. She's chief investigator in a research project on populism and how it distorts historical memory. Her distinctions include being elected a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and also for her work on German history, she was awarded last year the Konrad Adenauer Research Prize from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Berlin. In 2026, she will give the prestigious George Mossey Lectures in History at Madison University, Wisconsin. Jennifer is also one of our most innovative LGBTQ historians, her interests ranging from rent boys in Berlin to queer subcultures, the history of drag, and modern trans history. She has a particular interest in erotic photography, I think we all do, as a historical source. And she's working on a book about how erotic photography shaped queer identity in the era before the 1980s. And she was telling me yesterday she's very interested in, particularly in Armenian photography. So anything to do with photography, you can quiz her afterwards. And Jennifer's publications have reflected these very imaginative research interests over the years. For example, her first book in 2011, called Life Among the Ruins, Cityscape and Sexuality in Cold War Berlin, analysed how Berlin's subcultures were reborn after the Second World War. The historian, the late Gert Hetmers, commented, "This is one of the few books that deals with sexual geography in a broad historical perspective, with queer issues at its core." Jennifer has also advanced the field of queer history with a range of edited books. In 2013, together with Matt Cook, our speaker 2 years ago, she edited Queer Cities, Queer Cultures, Europe since 1945. The chapters there range from Helsinki to Madrid, from Amsterdam to Athens. And there they contrasted the city subcultures and showed how they were stimulated by international developments. One reviewer praised the book for its breadth, but also for showing what he said was queer history is messy. It is not just a liberating march forward. Other edited books include one on photography in 20th century German history, and last year she co-authored a book about Holocaust memory in the digital media. Her latest monograph is Queer Life After Fascism, Kinship and the Queer Art of History, Duke University Press, that's last year. This argues for kinship as a category of historical analysis, and it has already secured much praise. One reviewer has noted it as radical and inspiring, with its rich exploration of the pleasures and desires that have shaped queer lives. The book, in short, is already transforming how we might interpret history, and this reviewer particularly said it was going to challenge some of the stuffy German historical methodology. So that was quite an insight, I thought, when I read that. So Jennifer's lecture tonight will tell us more about this. It's really going to be on this theme. We welcome her to Southampton, and we very much look forward to being stimulated in new ways tonight. So over to you, Vicky.
Wow. Okay, that was quite an introduction. I don't know. Thank you so much, Mark. I mean, I'm just going to put this guy here. Perfect. Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. I have a really fond set of associations with Southampton. I actually did come to George Chauncey's lecture in 2012. And also, Neil Gregor was one of the people involved in nudging me to write or pull together a forum for German history, in which I wrote this article called Why Queer German History. And it's one of those pieces that really had legs. My favorite part about this article is that students use it to sort of justify to their supervisors that this is a legitimate kind of history writing. And so I feel very much at home here at Southampton, and I'm, aside from the weather, I like it. I like it very much. So thank you for welcoming me and coming to hear me speak. This is the fun part. There we go. My talk this evening, in both the form and its content, is a history of trans-inclusive queer solidarities and entanglements in the second half of the 20th century. And it's also what the Germans call a plaidoyer, an appeal to conceptualize and write the history of sexuality differently, more creatively, subjectively, and in kinship with the past that we seek to uncover. Really, it's an effort to conceptualize how we might write histories that are not always our own, mindfully and with purpose, to find a language and a method to steer us through the turbulent times we find ourselves in today, where we seem to have lost touch with histories of solidarity and working through, which were not always perfect, but formed a part of the queer history of the past half century. While some of these histories have increasingly trickled into the mainstream, influencing policy at the highest level, it bears asking about the strengths and weaknesses, the losses as well as the gains of the liberal democratic project of the late 20th century. And to quote one of my favorite British scholars of sexuality, Geoffrey Weeks, the world we have won, or rather all that we believed ourselves to have won, which seems right now so much in peril. In other words, what I'm going to do tonight is give an illustration drawing from Germany of how to think about queer and trans love, loss, solidarity, and struggle together, both intersectionally and across difference, as an appeal to think and write and relate differently to the queer past, as a way to build a more equitable future. But before I begin, a quick mention that one of the interesting things about the field of queer studies is the enormous footprint of queer trans work in the Anglo-American, and I'll add Canadian, universe, and especially at universities and including community groups. And that this is a fundamental difference between, say, here and Germany, and we'll see a little bit about that in a second. In this slide, we see several of the recent books that have come out in the last few years, with which my own book is in conversation, and my book, The Queer Art of History. In North America, especially, queer theory and queer and trans history is alive and thriving, with tenured positions, long-term research partnerships, and students like my own, shout out Noah, there he is, Noah Bordeaux, who has been awarded fellowships for trans history at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In Germany, while there's been some progress with my own recent Konrad Adenauer Prize of the Humboldt Foundation, and it's kind of worth pausing on that title, the Konrad Adenauer Prize, because this grizzled man was responsible, and I laugh, but I shouldn't, was responsible for some of the most heinous homophobic attacks against gay men, especially in the post-war period, whereas many people were persecuted by the police after 45, as under Hitler. So to have received an award in his name for the history of drag felt really subversive when that happened. So there's been a lag, though, in Germany, where in the university we don't see this same sort of vibrant universe. There have been dissertations in the pipeline. There are excellent exhibitions that really show us that there is an interest and an urgency for this work to enter into the public sphere. And it's urgent because we're witnessing there, as well as in other places, a form of backlash where almost every week a major politician from some of the mainstream parties goes on record to tell us about how dangerous these histories and these lives and lifestyles are in undermining the status quo. So another point to keep in mind as I speak with you tonight is how might a more intersectional history of queer and trans lives provide us with the tools and the capacities to fight what is certain to be a pitched battle on this long road we have ahead of us. And it's nice that Mark mentioned my book, because now you're going to hear a little bit about it, about how I got to this place to be asking the kinds of questions that I am of the past. In order to do this work, I argue we need to think methodologically as much as empirically about how we construct our histories. Because as you'll soon see, one of my arguments is that we have framed our studies of the past in such a way that we've limited what and whose stories we in fact see. To ensure we're on the same footing, let me give you a sense a little bit of who I am as an historian of sexuality, the kinds of questions I used to ask, and where maybe I see this new path, this other path as being fruitful. It's funny hearing Mark introduce the lecture series. I mean, I know almost every one of those people. It's a bit of a small world. I began too as a historian of sexuality, and I worked primarily with police and court case records, with law codes, with newspaper accounts, with photographs and memoirs. And my first book was a human geography of placemaking in post-World War II Berlin. And it focused on how police, welfare workers, and everyday people helped create the conditions for reconstruction East and West Berlin. Out of a series of commitments, social, emotional, and political commitments to sort of resurrect the traditional family, while policing those who didn't fit that model. Paul Betts has called Reconstruction recently Europe's civilizing mission turned inward, which, as a phrasing, gives you a good sense of how fraught this was. So my early work was meant to be experimental. I wanted to write the histories of straight and same-sex sexuality together in a single volume, to show how central the reconstruction of the family was to East and West Germany. And I turned to photography, to storytelling, and to narration, to immerse my reader in the emotional landscapes that made up divided Berlin, to encourage them to look, to listen, and to feel, in a sense, the scale of violence, the desperation for recovery, what Tina Kemp would go on to describe as a method that encourages sensorial engagement to draw out the historical and the affective backgrounds and foregrounds of images and texts, for what they can tell us about marginalized people who are so often not present in the historical record. And I love this photo. You don't always get to choose the photo for the cover of your book. I was lucky. I love this photo for how it kind of captures that argument around the complicated feelings of beauty in destruction, of violence, of nostalgia, of loss, and rebuilding. As Berkeley's Stefan Ludwig Hoffmann has argued, with the scale of destruction, the Allies came to change how they viewed German perpetrators. And I wanted to create in my reader a similar sense of embodied witnessing, to, in a sense, bring to life the emotions of the time by reading the bread and butter sources of history, of regulation, not just against the grain, but in a whole new way. Again, drawing out the sort of affective and performative features of eyewitness accounts and historicizing health office files, police investigation records, and vernacular and stylized photographs for creating changing ways of seeing and feeling the history of the Cold War. And here, just as an example of some of the photography of the post-45 period from East and West, and the point was, boy, doesn't it look a lot alike, right? So East and West Berlin, showcasing the family as a way of kind of reconstructing the nation, despite the massively different political projects on each side of the border. It was here that I began to develop an interest in the role of aesthetics in political claims making. So how we might look to everyday life, to art, and especially to photography as critical sites in the negotiation of citizenship and belonging. So instead of looking at sexual citizenship through the lens of social welfare and policing, building off of someone like T.H. Marshall's work, I wanted to understand rights and privileges in more personal, intimate terms through changes in subjectivity, affect, and collective affinities, in a way to see beyond dichotomous arguments around whose identities were celebrated and promoted by the state and which ones were policed as the target of reform. So this meant looking to artistic creation, to film, and to photography, and it also required a different set of methods to decipher how these sources worked. And I promised Neil that one of these photos was going to be here, and here it is. So we're going to talk about this in a second. So what, unbeknownst to me, I was thinking through what it would mean to write the history of the post-war period as a queer art of history. Imagining transgression in this way means thinking about the specific ways in which different sources create meaning in their own right. For photography, this means taking seriously an image's agentic quality, the way that a photo, speaks to you, pushes you to think certain things, how it pricks us to think of Roland Barthes' characterization in Camera Lucida, how they force a reaction from us, sometimes an erotic reaction. As I found out after I published an article with Manfred in it, and I received interesting emails from men who were just like, it's amazing that you got this into the American Historical Review, this beautiful, beautiful man. And I said, absolutely, that was the entire point. We can historicize these responses when we trace the social life of images, and especially when we think about the different relationships, the different ways we respond over time. These travels, thinking about a private photo and how it emerges maybe into a gallery space, and bring about different emotions over time. The relationships they call into being, they tell us about changing social, cultural, emotional, and political dynamics at work in different historical moments. So hang on, I wanted actually to stay on Manfred. To use the example from Herbert Tobias, the Manfred photo that I've written about in the book and also in this earlier article, it means asking how an image might move from gay subculture as a token of a fleeting sexual encounter to high art, the subject of a retrospective at the Berlin Gallery in 2009. So this image of Manfred, he was literally a pickup from West Berlin, brought back to the photographer's home, and 3 days they played together, and ultimately a bunch of these photos were taken, and ultimately many, many years later, this entered into the gallery space as a sort of a legitimate piece of art, whereas before it was just really a trophy photo of a fun weekend. So how does this actually reflect changing social, emotional, and political values around same-sex sexuality's changing place in the public sphere? Questions like these set me on a path towards the different optics of sex and queer and trans sociability in the 20th century. I had come to feel that there was a pattern in how historians of sexuality did their work. In the shadow of George Chauncey's phenomenal Gay New York, and then Matt Holbrook's Queer London, we were all, including me, writing city stories that told the history of homophobia and resistance in similar ways, as moving from shame to pride, mostly focused on men, and in the German context, looking chiefly at the coercive power of the state, whether in the Nazi period or the Cold War, and how people either blunted or succumbed to regulation. I wondered, might photography open up new lines of questioning, new temporalities, new pivot points, and most importantly, new people to actually investigate? I stumbled on a whole series of cruising photos, photos of male prostitutes, of rent boys by Herbert Tobias, and I wondered, why haven't we written about these folks? What do photographs like these tell us about parts of the gay scene that sit awkwardly and maybe even uncomfortably next to New Left filmmaker and activist Rosa von Braunheim's filmic ode to gay liberation from 1971 with the ginormous title, "It's not the homosexual that is perverse, but the situation in which he lives," even longer if I were to say it in German, that demanded queers stop wasting their time cruising and take to the streets. When I dug a little deeper, I found that there were massive tensions within the West German gay rights movement around subcultural practices, not just among the homophile activists of a generation before, whose explicit aim was assimilation, but among gay liberation groups of the 70s and 80s. Political activity rested on a denial or disavowal of gender nonconformity, of so-called excessive desire, of cruising, and of the street. And this isn't to say that this was just a German thing. Think of the famous moment after Stonewall in 1973, when gays and lesbians in New York City shouted down the Puerto Rican American drag queen, trans woman, and sex worker Sylvia Rivera, effectively saying people like her did not have a place in the movement. Suddenly, it was clear to me. We've let certain parts of the gay rights movement write their own story and later commemorate it through memorial initiatives that look back to this period in a sometimes anodyne and uncomplicated way. It's a similar story if we were to start with sexology as the frame. Although we've seen in the work of people like Katie Sutton, Rainer Herrn, and Laurie Marhofer that the interwar period created a language for understanding transsexuality in a human way and mobilized in opposition to the anti-sodomy laws, there were still huge challenges within sexological formations around race, as Laurie Marhofer and Heike Bauer have shown in their work. To say nothing of the fact that, as Howard Chang has argued for East Asia, sexology cemented trans lives as existing on a linear plane of transition instead of emphasizing life on a spectrum of possibilities, what he has called transtopia. Viewing trans bodies solely through the lens of medical transition, beginning with gender dysphoria and ending with hormones and medical intervention, Jonah Gard has argued that this hormonal time has limited how we understand trans people in the past, as always en route to some utopian place of contentment within a more authentic self in the present. This trans temporality or trans sense of time not only reproduces really heteronormative gender binaries of before and after, but it presumes a linear, progressive, and common set of experiences. And I wondered, how does photography intervene in this? Keep the aperture open, in a way, allowing us to see a broader range of affinities, of kinships, of ways of being in the world. I asked, in other words, what might artistic production reveal about other parts of the gay, lesbian, and trans scenes, including other possible subjectivities, associations, communities, turning points, and ways of life than those produced by the state, by sexology, and by the social movements of the 1970s, that the historiography lauds as having ushered in acceptance and the expansion of rights in the last years of the 20th century. So, to illustrate this point, let's linger over this image for a second, this amazing, amazing image. This is a photograph of Cheyenne, taken in 1996 at a bar in the district of Kreuzberg in Berlin called colloquially SO36. That's like the neighborhood designation. And if this was an undergraduate lecture, this is when I would kind of walk around and I would ask you what you see in this image, all the while really wanting to really underscore certain points. So I'm going to forgo with that, and I'm just going to tell you what you see. So go with me here. You'd offer up some brilliance, and then I'd say, it's surprising. One of the things that's surprising about this image is that we actually know very little about queer and trans of color experience in Germany. Relative to other subjects. I'd also say that it's curious because we don't have that many people doing this kind of work in universities, that most of the people doing work on folks like Cheyenne are community activist groups, and they're doing the bread and butter, research that is really exciting. That there's only one professor in all of Germany, Martin Lücke at the Free University, who is there specifically to oversee projects. I tell them that with the exception of this person, this is really the state of play in Germany. That the overwhelming emphasis has been on the Nazi period for good reason, and now increasingly on post-war persecution, and on gay men mostly, on legal and medical turning points, and on social movements. Only recently has the research moved into the 1970s and 80s. Historians absolutely hate doing the history of yesterday. So anything that's in the 1980s and 90s, for some folks, is just really off the table. Students might ask, where was this photo taken? And I'd say that what we do know is it was in a bar that is home since the 1990s to migrant queer communities who regularly host dance parties. You can still go, like Gay Hana, which features Homo-Oriental music, a mix of Turkish, Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew music for a lesbian, gay, non-binary, and trans audience. These nights are spun often by DJ EPEC, seen here on the left. And SO36 is also home to Black Gay Nights, where queers of color have carved out a space in the city for themselves. In other words, this photo of Cheyenne sort of blows their minds of what they think Germany is, and for good reason. And it speaks to the existence of a larger intersectional audience emblematic of a post-migrant Germany. That it was home to drag parties like this one, captured by photographer Nihad Nino Pusia, who himself fled war-torn Yugoslavia for Berlin, where he takes photos of the queer, trans, Roma, and Sinti communities to sort of humanize and destigmatize them. Again, shows the intersectional and transnational kinships that struggles that come together in places like Berlin. I asked Nino if he knew specifically who Cheyenne was. And he told me that she worked in a bakery by day and was originally from Brazil, part of the Tunta or the Sissi drag scene in 1990s Berlin. I actually learned last summer, happenstance, and Berlin is a little bit like this. I learned from a friend, somebody I met at a conference, a trans woman named Ruby, a Brazilian student in Berlin, that Cheyenne eventually moved home, and she now is still active, where she performs as a comedy queen in Brazil. This photo was taken up as part of an exhibition in the Schwules Museum in 2020 and is now featured both in my book and in my talk for you today, meaning it has also moved from its original subcultural setting to the hallowed halls of academe, such as they are, and says something about the legitimacy of these themes in certain places, in Canada, in the US, in the UK, but not in Germany. Where here too, now versus a few short years ago, this story, drag in general, is increasingly under siege. What about this photo of Johnny Kingsize on the left, a member of the early 2000s drag kings group, Kings of Berlin, photographed by Annette Frick, who made a career photographing punks and queens. She was keen to document self-presentation, how people construct themselves in a public capacity, and her work is bound up with the fluidity of identity, body, sex, and gender. Frick thrives on the tensions between Johnny's presentation as butch, or perhaps as transmasc, and the language on their arms. In Johnny's own words, "I have never defined myself as a lesbian, butch, or anything, yet being a drag king was only partly playful for me." Johnny goes on to see drag as an essential step towards my current life as a trans something, maybe a trans man. Like trans film scholar Eliza Steinbach's notion of cinema's shimmering images that defy the rigidity of gender binaries and identity, photography has that capacity to blur fixed and firm boundaries, allowing us to see diversity in its multiple forms. Others have used photography as part of this narration of the self. In East Germany, Nadia Schallenberg, seen in the small photograph center left, fashioned this self-portrait of her as part of her coming out album for her parents one Christmas. It's an interesting Christmas gift. In it, she assembled photos, poems, correspondence, and newspaper clippings to help communicate her sense of self as what she called a lestra, a lesbian, transsexual, androgynous woman, and punk. Schallenberg helped establish the transsexual counseling service at the Sonntagsclub, an East German gay and lesbian mutual aid center, where she worked to bring folks to the table from gay, lesbian, and trans communities to gather in each other's differences and find common ground. Photography and life writing gave Nadia, like Nora Eckert next to her on the slide, who worked at the nightclub Café Hague in West Berlin that David Bowie frequented, because David Bowie, of course, was in Berlin during all this time. And Nora Eckert also documented her life through images, as a tool to better understand herself, leaving a record behind as well for other queer and trans persons to really explore the spaces and places of love, compassion, self-help, in kinship with those in their midst. Photography also highlights some of the tensions within feminist and lesbian and trans scenes, and among historians seeking to understand those worlds. So while the transsexual Charlotte von Malsdorf is pretty well known in Germany and to us in North America after the success of the Broadway adaptation of her memoir, I Am My Own Wife, I want to talk about this photo on the far right. Some photo collections from the former East Germany employed the conventions of studio and portrait photography to try and reframe queer and trans relationships from heteronormative imaginings. In a wonderful book, Love in the Time of Communism, Josie McClellan discusses the stunning couples photo of Rita Thomas and her partner Helly together with their most amazing two very well-groomed poodles. And dogs and lesbianism is a bit of a thing right now. So in case you're interested, there's lots and lots of wonderful work that explores this, goes down that rabbit hole as well. Thomas, who from the age of 15 adopted the nickname Tommy, stands behind her partner dressed in a vest and cravat, sporting a coiffed hairstyle commonly found among mods. Were we to focus solely on the studio shot and not on the other myriad images in the Thomas collection, we'd have to concede that its staging of a relationship, seems pretty conventional. Taken alongside her stated biography, featured in the 2003 Schwules Museum exhibition, right in the middle, Gay Men and Women in Berlin, 1945 to 69, it speaks to the long-term love and partnership of these two women, who over the years built a business, had a vibrant social life, and became politically active in the early East German gay rights movement, which, unlike Across the Wall in the West, also included women. So it was an intersectional movement. But if we just stop there, we foreclose other points of entry into the world of non-normative gender identification, of kinship across difference, and sexual expression that likewise animated Tommy's world. As we see in this photo, looking really huge on the slide compared to what I'm used to. What we see in this photo, Tommy is dressed in drag with friends for carnival or for fashion. She performed in cross-dressing performances with the activist cabaret group Hibaret, and by all accounts, she held wild parties in her house And as Andrea Rothman shows in her brilliant new book, she and Helle frequented all manner of establishments with women who likewise flouted conventional portrayals of femininity. When we view Tommy's photographs as evidence of lesbian subjectivity, we gain access into the world of alternative female intimacies and same-sex desire among cis and alternatively gendered women, a world frequently written out of the history of LGBTQI life and experience. Yet if we view these photographs simply as a reflection of a static, transparent, and bounded set of identity categories, we neglect the complex web of experiences and subjectivities that not only may have changed across time, as languages for self-actualization have and do, but we similarly discount the possibility of polyvalent lives percolating in and around Tommy's community itself. So in other words, as Jack Halberstam has argued, in order to be in a position to recognize the insufficiencies of fixed and firm identity categories, we need to think in new and different ways about what it means to claim a body. At the same time that Tommy's visual archive is absolutely essential in addressing what is missing in the historical record in terms of female same-sex community and desire, without what Katie Sutton calls an ethics of attentiveness to protocols we might use to imagine the possibility that transmasculine and transfeminine bodies also intermixed in this story, we disregard the possibility of trans realities that might have resided beyond the frame. What this kind of reading of photography does is challenge many of the assumptions that outsiders and insiders, scholars and lay people have about what it means to be German, let alone queer today, as well as in the past. It challenges the broad strokes acceptance of universal categories like identity and suggests the need for more nuanced, intersectional, and often transnational ways of seeing and reading the queer and trans past. The lesson we might learn from viewing the German past this way allows us to better understand race, sexuality, gender presentation, and identity in the late 20th and early 21st century. It is at once an historical analysis of queer and trans lives and community and a commentary on historical practice more broadly, an art of history, a way of doing things differently. Let me concretize where this sits in German historiography for a minute and raise a few points about my book, this concept's other intellectual commitments, as there are other lessons as well around identity, citizenship, and democratic practice. I argue in the book that there's a triumphalist narrative within queer history of moving from illegality to full citizenship that has often been written as part of the success story of the Federal Republic and post-unification Germany, also of much of the West as well. Of course, legality was hard fought and hard won. And as I hinted earlier, at least in Germany, the same number of people were jailed in post-war West Germany as during the Nazi period, some 50,000 people, under the same Nazi version of the law until 1969. And it's a slightly different story in the East. This story of liberalization, of successful integration, also animates much of the thinking of mainstream queer organizations, like the LSVD, the largest queer organization in Germany. That the building of the Homo Monument in 2011, official apologies for wrongdoing during the Third Reich and post-war period, and the establishment of gay marriage in 2017 meant equal citizenship was achieved, the result of this long battle. Well, this claim rests on several assumptions. One is that the experience of equality is equally felt and accessible to all. And two, that challenges to equality are somehow external to the German state and to German society. Although this is currently undergoing considerable revision with the anti-trans movement taking hold in many parts of the West, queer and trans rights are often held up as the measure of liberal democracy, what Jasbir Puar has called homonationalism, for the way it often overlooks tensions within the states themselves, especially around race, but also around kink. In One-Dimensional Queer, Yale's Roderick Ferguson sees this as the watering down of an intrinsically radical movement into the single issue topic of gay liberation, instead of focusing on how liberationist discourses often wrestled with a whole range of issues, not always successfully, but with critiques of racial capitalism, with decolonization, migration, and income inequality, to say nothing of other issues, like gender presentation, as my book tries to show. The belief that legal equality somehow translates into social equality obfuscates fractures in the social contract, revealing something much more coercive. As Lisa Dugan has argued, it's created a kind of homonormativity, draining queerness of its radical force to disrupt norms and build new worlds. Instead of dreaming up new social formations, and these are Lisa Dugan's words, we've been administered a kind of political sedative. We get marriage, we get the military, then we go home and we cook dinner forever. I said this in a German context, Noah will know, and one of the members of the LSBD group thought that I was critiquing them directly, and then they stalked me for 2 months afterwards in a bunch of emails. So this sentiment is very hard taken. Just one example of this might be seen in the Homo Monument itself, unveiled in 2011. And if you've been to Berlin, you've seen it. It's right across from the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. You know, it was a great achievement, formally acknowledging the persecution of gays and lesbians through the inclusion of lesbians and trans persons in the category of victim, even though that has not been simple. The memorial plaque in front of the concrete cube in the Tiergarten gives the sense that homophobia is something that is experienced in other parts of the world, something foreign, no longer present in today's Germany. And given the discourse within German and international queer press at the time, it is clear that this was meant to suggest that the liberal West had overcome and that it was other places, especially the East or the Middle East, where the danger lurked. This sentiment of the foreignness of homophobia was mirrored in the many organized kiss-ins that took place in front of mosques in the 1990s, when a wave of street altercations put migrant communities under the microscope, while homegrown homophobia was never a focus of concern. In other words, the media, state, and society approach to gay equality has within it a history of racism that still needs unpacking. Another part of the historiography is the focus almost exclusively on gay male experience. And there are reasons for this, logical reasons, mostly because people wrote the story of legal persecution, and so they followed paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code and saw that this was the burning issue. And in fact, it has been challenging to incorporate lesbian and trans experience into the public memory of queer persecution. And the pushback from within the community has been immense. The editor of the leftist Taz newspaper, Jan Federsen, went so far as to label folks who called for a broader intersectional history of queer life proponents of a kind of queer Gita, a reference to the populist citizens' initiatives that held weekly marches in Dresden. Others, like Alexander Zinn, who was part of the commission to have the memorial built and now works at the Fritz Bauer Institute, opposed all efforts to include lesbians, and now he extends this to trans people, in memorialization of Nazi crimes. He somehow even managed to publish an op-ed last year in Germany's paper of record, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, suggesting that efforts among academic feminists, kind of like me, and proponents of queer theory, also kind of like me, that we were almost as bad as those in, these are his words, not mine, those in Muslim countries who would throw his kind off of the rooftops. So there's this strange way that some well-positioned queer men now argue that trans persons, academic feminists, and scholars of intersectional queer history are imperiling the project of universal equality for shining a light on the politics of race, class, and gender in the movement. If this is the political center and not the radical right, it bears asking, how the heck did we get here? And what does this tension between perceived universalism and the blind spots to power and identity tell us about queer and trans life in the past as well as today? In drawing lessons from Germany, my book questions this disconnect. On the one hand, how aspects of the queer past have been drawn upon to make a series of important claims about liberal democracy, the social contract, and the place of identity in rights-based discourses of experience, policy, and governance, while at the same time used as a cudgel against those who would argue there's a more rich, complex, intersectional, cool past, provided we look for it. I suggest that in centering a triumphalist historical narrative based around decriminalization and the attainment of key social rights, following Wendy Brown and Jose Munoz, on the tensions within these categories themselves, legal equality has come on the back of a kind of race-blind, gender-conformist identity politics that flies in the face not just of inequalities within the various scenes around gender presentation, around race and sexual desire, but by a kind of respectability politics that fails to appreciate histories of solidarity, of tension, of opposition, and of kinship across difference, that fails to appreciate these, that also made up the history of queer life after fascism. My boldest claim is to highlight that the challenge to queer and trans rights in today's Germany comes from the far right unmistakably, but it is aided ever increasingly by the backsliding of the liberal center, which has come about through a de-radicalization of queer politics since the 1970s. Let me give you a few reasons for this, and then I'll conclude. We've largely written our queer histories out of a sexological and social movement frame, which has reproduced a narrative of assimilation and respectability over parallel traditions of world-making that challenge sensibilities in fundamental ways. Lauren Stokes, Frank Bies, Tiffany Florville, Damani Partridge have all shown that there were limits to citizenship in the Federal Republic of Germany, particularly around race, but also around forms of sexuality deemed outside the bounds of respectability, as might be seen in the antipathy of the West German homophile and gay liberation groups against cruising and anonymous sex, or conflicts between gender non-conforming Tunten queens in the working class gay liberation movement, or the disavowal of intergenerational sex in the scene, which results in a conflict between radical and more assimilationist tendencies within the movement. These more reformist factions include within them a hesitance to work across difference with lesbians, with feminists, a demonization of effeminacy, and participation in the 1990s in these kiss-ins in front of mosques to demonstrate the power of Western values. It is one of the reasons why gay marriage sometimes looks a lot like heteronormative white middle-class family values, right? And Joe Fischel at Yale and Tom Hooper at York University in Toronto have made similar arguments about the US and Canadian Pride events, which have begun to mobilize against kink and with the participation of police and corporations, fundamentally altering that spirit of radical alterity. We have forgotten the history of conflict and solidarity, these alternative paths. They're not even just forgotten, they're hard to imagine in the first place. Our histories, activists as well as scholarly, have adopted not only the kind of teleology of liberalization, but a narrow emphasis on identity, which has meant we're not always able to see the history of collective mobilizations, entangled lives, and moments of working together across difference that were likewise part of the queer and trans past, whether that be groups that frequented Ellie's Beer Bar in Kreuzberg, owned by a leather-clad former Nazi lesbian, and home to gay, trans, and street worker clientele who worked together during police raids to protect the most vulnerable. Or like the HIB, the HIB in East Berlin, which included male, female, and trans activists, and saw the mere act of socializing as an important tool of political opposition. They also held drag performances and fancy dress parties for Easter and parades through East Germany. It's quite an amazing thing to think about in a dictatorship. Or feminists and lesbian separatists who mobilized together against abortion and the right-wing press. We often impose contemporary identity categories onto past lives that were lived much more fluidly than we're able to imagine. Using kinship as our way in, as an analytical category, not as a synonym for the family, but in echoing Indigenous feminist Kim Tallbear as a form of relationality, emphasizing the ties that bind our historical actors to each other and to the past and us to them, allows us new insight into the fraught ways in which Germans confronted race, gender nonconformity, and sexuality in social movements, art, and everyday life. A cautionary tale against a triumphalist politics of remembering, while at the same time modeling a difference-based diversity that transcends siloed identities, my book tries to tell the story of entanglements and alliances as queer and trans people tested out new possibilities for life, love, public and family life in the 20th and 21st century. At the heart of this is what I call a queer art of history. That is something that nudges us to write more imaginatively, expansively, creatively, drawing on interdisciplinary methods for ways we might read our sources, for how they create and construct entangled relationships of affinity, of attachment and community, forms of belonging in the past that help condition how we might, conceptualize, imagine our future. The book does this by extending kinship to our own relationship to these histories. I'm very present in the book as acts of revision of some of my earlier ideas. I'm an interlocutor. I'm part of the queer kinship networks that are intellectual as well as emotional and sometimes erotic, especially if we follow Audre Lorde's famous ideas reflecting her own time in Berlin, when she argued that through our own cultural production, whether that's taking photos, whether that's writing stuff, whether that's doing the work that we do, that we all place ourselves in kinship with others as agents of change. The final chapter of my book explores how contemporary artists, filmmakers, and photographers enmesh themselves and us, the viewer audience, in these networks of trans-inclusive queer history making, demonstrating the power of kinship as intellectual and emotional solidarity with the past that is not always our own, so as to imagine new futures together. Let me bring us back into view with this photo of Cheyenne by way of a conclusion. As this photo shows, queer life after fascism was multifaceted. It was plurivocal. It was unexpected. It was made up of diverse solidarities and associations that are often absent from the historical register, not because they didn't exist, but because a presumed universalism has failed to take into account inequalities within the very conceptualization of queer citizenship, aided by the limits in how we think of and write this history itself. As the literary scholar Saidiya Hartman described already in 2003, cultural histories of power and liberation must do more than recount the desire for inclusion within the limited set of possibilities that the national project provides. What is necessary is a radical rethinking of what emancipatory politics means when the language of freedom, choice, and rights simply reinforces in a new register boundaries around who gets to belong and who doesn't. The lessons we might draw from Germany is that we need to rethink this history. We need to trouble it. And we need to invite ourselves to imagine a much richer, much more equitable, and hopefully better future for all our queer and trans kin. Thank you.
Well, Jen, when I was listening to you and thinking, well, what should I say after you finish? My mind wandered back to a previous one of these Stonewall lectures where a member of the audience who was asking a question stood up and said, "Thank you for your bejeweled lecture." And I've always remembered that phrase as just possibly the loveliest way I've ever heard anyone say thank you to a speaker. And I don't think I can sort of beat that. So I'm just going to sort of channel that guy who I don't know and say, well, thank you for your bejeweled lecture, Jen. That was really wonderful. We do have time, as always, for a few questions. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, I'm getting a very sort of Gestapo-like light from the thing, so I can't actually see anybody's faces, but you might have to wave quite frantically. Maybe just stand over here a little. That's better. Dan, go on.
Thank you, Jen, for this bejeweled lecture. I'll borrow that phrase too. You're very critical in this talk about the institutional sort of environment in Germany. And coming, as I do, from sort of Russian studies, I feel like, well, it would be wonderful to have those institutions, and looking at it from a Russian perspective. I wonder if you could just say a few more words about what's good and what's not good about the institutional environment. And by institutional environment, I mean things like the Schwules Museum in Berlin, you've read it quite a lot in the slides, and other museums and exhibitions, archives, and so on. So there's a kind of institutional environment there where queer history is being catalogued and housed and reproduced in different ways. But it sounds like academia is not there for you. So talk a little bit more about that and what could be done better.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason. I'm so glad you picked up on that. I mean, you know, I'm always drawing attention to the incredible collection at the Schwules Museum. You know, it's the kind of place, unlike other archives, gay and lesbian archives, you know, it's the kind of place where if you go to Berlin and you just have half an hour and you happen in that part of the town, you show up and they will instantly bring you in, show you whatever it is you're looking for. Like, they're very responsive. They want to be there for you, and not all archives, especially formal German archives, are like that. And they have done the bulk of work of tapping into community and really gathering material to you know, make this available for researchers of all backgrounds and persuasions. And they have so much more information, so much more material than you can even imagine. Every time I go back, I get another little tour of their basement, and they've got, you know, person X's estate and person Y's photos, and then sometimes they'll be like, and here's the really awful paintings that so-and-so gave us, and we don't know what to do with these, but we had to take them, you know. But they have so much material. And what's interesting, though, right, is that as much as that's an incredible resource, and it is, overwhelmingly, the material that they collected came from certain populations and not others. So there's not a huge amount of trans content in the Schwules Museum. But they recognized that this was an issue, and so they liaised with members of the trans community and said, come in and, you know, find those stories that we've overlooked. You know, read this material against the grain. And they ultimately, the two people in particular, participated in something called an unboxing. So they basically sort of reread some of these photos, documents, and whatever, in order to find you know, trans experiences, gender nonconformism in the archive. So they are really at the cutting edge, but that's not alone. It's not just a Berlin thing. You know, there are tiny, tiny, tiny archives, exhibitions, researchers all throughout Germany that are doing this kind of work. And many of them are doing it on a shoestring budget. They might get government support for it. And, you know, so it's not just a Berlin thing, is what I'm saying. But the takeaway is, it's not people like me. It's not academics, right? It is very much from community. And there's a massive interest in all of this work. So that's interesting, because that tells you that it's absolutely necessary that we find ways of funding this kind of research. And then the disconnect, which is just shocking from a North American, Anglo-American perspective, is just that it really is not respected by the university. I mean, my talk that I gave last year in Berlin, amazing turnout, massive turnout, and it was a huge coup d'etat to have me give this lecture, you know, with the support of the Humboldt Prize, because it communicated to our colleagues, and Neil knows sort of what that culture, the German university, German history culture, very, very, very conservative, that sees this as just fashionable, fly-by-night, not commenting on the bigger issues. And so it really is interesting that the university has not caught up. You know, the discourse in my country, in Canada and the US, right, is that it's university professors who are evil and woke and pushing an agenda and all the rest. They're not even in the door in Germany to be doing that, right? They can't be woke because they're not there. So it is surprising considering, right? This was also Germany, a place where other victims, stories were, one would think, necessary to process sort of the national sort of, coming to terms with the violence of the past. And so it's been a long struggle, and we're slowly getting there, but not as quickly as one might have hoped and imagined. I mean, it's not Russia, but we can expect more from Germany, is what I'm saying. Anytime that we see, so in terms of, I'll say one last thing, because maybe you have questions. Anytime we've seen changes in terms of memorial culture. So a year ago, colleagues of ours testified in front of Parliament about persecution of gay, lesbian, and trans people during the Nazis. Anytime that's happened, it's come from the left parties, sometimes the communist parties, in sponsoring these initiatives. So it's also something that is coming from the fringes. When the subject of gay, lesbian, and trans victims of the Nazis should be, not something that's seen as esoteric and strange. That should be part of a nation's reckoning with itself. So it isn't all sunshine and roses in Germany at the same time that this work is increasingly happening. There's still much more to do.
So I gather we've got a question online.
Oh, okay.
So while you run up with the microphone, we've also got a question over there. Thank you. So, can't run up with the microphone.
Hello, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I think my question will be related to just your answer to the previous question. Actually, I'm very curious about your process, how you actually found the materials for your book, because you said that, well, it's like so many archives are available, so many evidence in terms of the arts and photography. What was your process when you made a decision what exactly to include in your book and what you kind of also valuable, but you decided to leave out? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's also a kind of it's an interesting, like it's not your typical, it's not a social history, it's a cultural history. So it's not really trying to make claims of gathering everything and then analyzing it, empirically. So it's really not doing that kind of work. So, that said, I do make certain decisions, what to include, what to draw on, what resonates. And that method is very much sort of driven by, the kinds of questions that I find interesting, the work that I've done with artists and through some of these networks. So it's also reconstructing a little bit my way into this story. Part of the book does work with an artist. I worked with an artist. The cover of the book, if you remember the first slide, I worked with an artist from Canada who lived in Berlin for a time and who did a whole bunch of work on sort of reimagining the German queer past. And so I worked with him. That was part of sort of the process, part of the source base that I used. And a lot of the material did come from the Schwules Museum, the bulk of the photos. So yeah, I was really just interested in finding photos that really spoke to this sort of diversity of experiences that you don't always expect. Like this image is just so great in so many ways because it really challenges what it means to think, when you think German, this is not who you're thinking, right? And so it's really a useful image of showing that Germany is a very different place now, that these communities have found their way in the world, they're established, and they're working with other communities, in some cases expat communities, to sort of navigate this new Germany. And so yeah, it's not your typical history. And it's not researched in the way one would typically research a very bounded kind of social history, let's say.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I've got the fun job of monitoring the online activity, and I've had a couple of questions come in for you, so perhaps we could take one at a time. The first one says, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I'm wondering if the term kinship isn't perhaps a little misleading, hinting to familial genealogical relations. What about Goethe's? And here, as a non-German speaker, I'm afraid I'm going to struggle. Are you able to see it, Neil, from the...
elective affinities.
Yes,
is that right?
yes, elective.
Wahlverwandtschaften.
Thank you. Okay, Goethe's elective affinities. They are not given, but elected.
Yeah, thank you. I don't even know where to look for answering the person online, so I apologize. No, this is a wonderful question. I kind of thumbs up to the question because it allows me to speak a little bit to the method that I use, the conceptual framework for the book. And that is, it is not coming from Goethe, although it would have easily and could have made sense. Instead, it's drawing from, very bizarrely, to Germanists. It is looking instead to Black feminism and the way in which kinship is thought in sort of post-slavery as precisely this. You know, we've lost our connections to our kin due to the violence of the Middle Passage. We have to create affinities. We have to create families from those in our midst. And so this is where you know, my conceptualization of kinship comes from. So it's very definitely not about family or found family. Even it's really about the ties that bind us. And one could have easily used Goethe to sort of illustrate this point, and I didn't for a whole host of reasons, because I am trying to kind of wrestle with the place of race in this whole story. So kinship is not meant to resurrect sort of a familial lens, genealogical maybe, but it is about these affinities that come into being.
I mean, just to, I suppose, butt in there, if I may, while we're on kinship. I mean, I associate that with a sort of intellectual archaeology that sort of takes you back into early anthropology, the sort of social anthropologists like Evans Pritchard and all those sort of long forgotten names who themselves were kind of implicated in a certain set of cultures that you probably wouldn't necessarily want to associate your own work with. I suppose what I'm taking from you is that you're kind of part of a project of reappropriating that language and almost, this might be harsh, but sort of detoxifying it from that archaeology that probably is not yours. So.
Yeah, and it also comes specifically from questions that are animated in queer theory around kinship, around how to think about precisely this, right? The affinities networks that we create, some are sanctioned, some are not. And so it is, in that moment, it's speaking back to queer theorists and saying, okay, this is where this book fits into that. It's also one of the main reasons why the German historians, you know, couldn't understand my lecture last year, because they were like, where's Max Weber? And I was like, he's not here. Sorry. Somewhere else you'll find him. But you know, so yeah, this is a nice question. This goes back to the sources, or in this case, method. I very deliberately kind of bound my analysis by different reference points, which will either be, what was the quote you said, like radical rethinking, or absolutely crazy, right? So it will depend on where that lands, you know, how it's viewed. But it was meant to really sort of speak to certain other arguments that are in the wider field and not just in German history.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. The second online question we have, and this is quite a biggie, in light of the current backlash against queer and trans rights in various parts of the world, what strategies do you believe are most effective in combating these regressive forces? And how in particular could academics or broader communities contribute to a more inclusive and diverse understanding of queer and trans histories in the futures? Where should your work and others' work go next?
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, this is the question, right? It's a beautiful question. And I mean, I suppose, you know, what made me want to write, it's so interesting. When I wrote this book, I was talking to Neil before we started about, you know, writing books and what it all feels like. There's a lot that goes into writing a book, right? And I know for me, mine was, you know, at the end, I felt like it was a bit of a love letter to the field, right? It was like recognizing the work that we've done, the work that still needs to happen. It was trying to sort of lay bare the kind of the kind of work that we've tried to do with communities to really unearth these stories that are and fraught and interesting for the way in which they don't graft onto the way we view the world today, right? We're all in our boxes, and they make perfect sense to us, but there was a time before where people moved, not always easily, but between communities, and held their noses and said, this is, I can't stand these people, whoever they are, but we're going to work together because this is an issue that we need to stare down at face value. And I suppose sort of my answer is, like, the book is meant to show us that it was possible. And so wouldn't it be nice if we could find our way to some of those places today, right? Instead of seeing our work as really siloed. And I suppose that's the kind of lesson that I was trying to bring out in the book, is that we've lost touch with these wonderful stories, and we need everybody, right? Like, we need absolutely everybody. And so they have done it before. We can do it maybe too, right? So that's kind of where the motivation came from.
Mm-hmm. Mark, just have to wait for your mic, I think.
Mine isn't a question about world history, really. It's really, I wanted to perhaps to focus you on, because you mentioned in a way gay male narratives dominating, or particularly in the way of persecution. And I wanted to ask you about lesbian narratives in Germany, and how far, well, in a very general way, really, but also what reception you have got from lesbian groups for your work, and particularly perhaps older lesbians who might have a particular view on how they fit into these narratives. So I haven't completely formulated what my question is, but it was really to hear about lesbian narratives and whether you felt that you were getting a positive reaction from people in the audiences that you've to your ideas.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's the thing, is that I like to think that this book speaks to the diversity of experience in the different communities, and how, again, how people have come together at certain moments. But because I'm not doing what is expected, and that is, if you were to look at all of the wonderful books in history of sexuality, right? It's like, Andrea Rothman's wonderful book is about queer lives in Berlin, but it's chiefly lesbian experience, right? Like, we really have sort of separated these things out into their different categories. And so if there's any pushback, it's that people want to see maybe more visibility for their particular group, and there's not always the sense of what I am trying to do in terms of showing the intersectionality of people, practices, presentation. So that's one of the things where maybe I get a little bit of, we want more, we want more visibility, we want more of a piece of the pie, so to speak. So that's definitely one of the places that I receive, not necessarily pushback, but just, there is such a thirst for more. One of the things I want to write about for this, it's not necessarily for the Mossy lecture, but something else, is sort of, some of the origins of these splits between sort of more radical lesbians and trans folks in the 70s, because I think we can kind of map our current struggles back to these moments in the 70s. And so there is something there that needs to be pulled apart even more. How that will go over, is anybody's guess, probably not positively. But this is the kind of work that needs to happen. So I should say too that the folks that do German queer work, lesbian, gay, trans, we built a really lovely sort of, I don't want to call it an emotional community, but maybe it is, a mutually supportive group of folks sharing resources, providing platforms, and really working very hard to open doors and open more doors and bringing students through. And that, I think, is also a really nice outcome of these kinds of things. How we're accepted in Germany is complicated because a lot of the community activists have been doing this work for some time, and we are kind of coming at things from a different place, and so sometimes there's not always trust, or there's the sense that we're sort of our own, we're motivated by our own kind of careerism, and they're in the trenches every day, and they are. So, there are interesting, it's fraught. It's not to say that it's an easy relationship at all times, so.
Thank you. I was wondering, in your research, what did you find with German reunification? Was that, what was the significance of that with the communities that you studied with LGBTQ memories? Was it positive? Was it neutral, negative, anything? Really, I'd be curious.
Yeah, and that's such a great question, because there were these two different traditions. I mean, East Germany had decriminalized homosexual anti-sodomy laws. Somewhat earlier, they'd gotten rid of the Nazi version of the law, and in other areas of sort of sexual rights and freedoms, they were extremely forward-thinking. So abortion on demand, especially being the best example. And so 1989 was this moment where you have these kind of different cultures of towards sexuality, sexual freedoms, and for people on the ground, gay and straight. Yeah, it was a whole new world to have to navigate. A lot of the folks in the East, it's fascinating because their mutual help society that they created in Berlin, the Sonntagsclub, still exists. They just celebrated an anniversary party last summer in Berlin. They definitely felt a little bit out of step with their West German sort of activist colleagues, and so those tensions were still there, although they've largely gone away even today. But so that divide, that was 40-something years, right? And it was felt in all sorts of different ways. So that's a story that's still being written, still being told. I had a master's student who did a little bit of work on the Wende on 1989, because it really is still worth thinking about, especially with the fact that you can interview people and ask their experiences of having gone from one sort of regime to another, right? So these are interesting tensions for sure.
Oh, I'll ask one then. I'm not letting you leave without coming back to Manfred.
Where is he? Yeah,
where is he?
There he is.
Yeah. See, I was kind of intrigued by your reading of these photos in the book, where you you set this up, if I've understood you rightly, as this kind of example of intergenerational encounter where these guys sort of spend a long weekend together or whatever it is, and it just sounds exhausting, really. And then one takes photos of the other, and I mean, I think what you're drawing attention to, and this is kind of made a lot of sense to me, was the sort of need to think about just how people play out their erotic lives in these kind of landscapes, and in a way that just isn't captured by writing these conventional histories of the sort of social movement of legal reform and protest and whatever. But I was also struck when you were talking just now that you referred to these as trophy photos, and that seems to me to open up a slightly different possibility of reading these images as kind of the product of a relationship of inequality. Right? I mean, he's a rent boy. He's looking back at the camera slightly defiantly and angrily, it seems to me, possibly. There is something transactional about this as well. And as soon as you start talking about trophy photos, you're wheeling out this sort of language of kind of colonial violence. Maybe inadvertently, I don't know, but that's what my mind went to. So I wonder if there's a sort of danger that in taking the approach that you do, we don't sort of write out some of the kind of more violent sides to this story that perhaps need to be foregrounded too. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So yes, one of the things that's so interesting about that is in the book, you know, what I try to do is I try to say, you know, the fact that we come at these images primarily now, today, seeing it as conquest, let's say, seeing it as inequality, and it very well could be, was, right? Could easily be. But when we see that as determinative, when we see that as the only way to think about this relationship, we fail to appreciate maybe that Manfred had some agency, that he believed himself to be, you know, a participant in this erotic exchange. It's not to say he was or he wasn't. It's to say, why can't we imagine that as part of the landscape? Why do we only see it as sexual danger and predation? And what is the danger in doing that? You know, it means that instances where people were actually fully, completely into it, those stories don't come out, right? Mm-hmm. And we've seen this a lot, and this is actually super interesting because the Schwules Museum has just done a massive exhibition on sexual violence and intergenerational sex within the gay scene in Berlin. And absolutely, that's essential. And of course it was part of the story, and of course it was part of the scene. But when we only tell that story, we fail to appreciate that people's sexual lives are messy and complicated, that people enter into relationships of power, but sometimes experience those experiences of power as hot, right? And so when we don't have a space for that, when we only see it as coercion, we're not really doing justice to the broad diversity of experiences for people, right? And so absolutely, I maybe lean heavily on it's not necessarily solely violent in order to sort of get us to say, okay, maybe we need to at least go there a little bit, right? So for sure, I lean on that.
Do you know anything of Manfred's voice, or does he?
No, just
speak?
the photos. No,
just
the photos, and in the there's like an accompanying text from where it was published at one point. I mean, he surfaces multiple times, right? After a while, you're just like, Manfred, like how many times? He's like in 2 different issues. You know, he's all over the place. But the encounter, what's interesting about it is that when I first published about Manfred, I spoke about the, you know, the photo, the counter gaze, all of these things, and I neglected to actually think about the text that came along with one of the iterations of the Manfred photo, in which, you know, I had completely forgotten that it wasn't just Manfred and Herbert Tobias, it was Manfred, Herbert Tobias, and some actress. And so what's interesting about that is we think only that this is, you know, gay subculture. And yet that gay subculture included an actress for 3 days. She left after a while, and then these photos were taken. So the fact that we can't even imagine, right, this sexual encounter as being complicated in all sorts of ways. There's shaving cream at one point. It's a lot of information. But the fact that we can't even imagine that really says something about, again, these very siloed identity frames that we have that maybe didn't necessarily reflect the reality of the sexual play of the time, right? Mm-hmm. So when I say I put myself into the book, you know, I offer that up and say, like, I totally missed that. And so now here's my opportunity to say, okay, why did I not see that? And how important is it to try to put that story back in, right?
Are there any more? Okay. Right, well, Mark has been badgering me all day to make sure I also mention his wine. I don't know how much he's ordered, but he's clearly quite troubled by the fact that, you know, there might be quite a lot left. So I wouldn't have a problem with this if it was my event. But anyway, so let me just once again thank Jen. If you've not had an opportunity to dip into the book, then I thoroughly recommend it as an incredibly sort of thoughtful, reflective, stimulating read. It's interesting, obviously for scholars of German history and for scholars of queer studies, but it's interesting beyond that, just for the way she sort of goes about thinking about what we're doing when we're trying to work with this kind of material and how we sort of package it up in words, as it were. And so it's really kind of, you know, made me think very hard about the practice of what we do more generally. So I do thoroughly recommend it. But anyway, let's just end by thanking Jen once more for a wonderful talk.